Before getting into the outline and structure of the presentation today, I will start my presentation with a map that shows some significant subnational variation in local government performance in Turkey, a very centralized country with a unitary system, to bring this research question into some perspective. In this map, we see the average completion time of public health infrastructure projects for each district in Turkey, which are around 970. And as you can imagine, the completion time of such health and education infrastructure projects is a big problem in many countries, as projects tend to take too long due to the low state capacity or other political reasons, and citizens miss the opportunity to have better access to public services, public healthcare services in the meantime. And when we look at the trends in Turkey, in some districts, health infrastructure projects takes almost 2 years to complete, while in other top performing districts, it takes less than a year. And what's remarkable here is that in Turkey, the empirical setting of the study, most local public services and local governance processes, including health, education, and even village infrastructure, are actually provided and administered by the central government through a very strict hierarchy seen on this slide, with almost zero fiscal and political decentralization. And because of this unitary structure of the Turkish state and the governance processes, you don't expect to see much subnational variation in local government performance. But many indicators about these centrally administered services and processes or projects, as well as my observations from 8 months of fieldwork, showed that there was substantial variation in how bureaucracies function and deliver services at the local level. In some places, it was much easier to implement projects, and governance processes seem much more efficient and effective, while in other places I was seeing problems typical to bureaucracies. And these observations were the main motivation of this project and led me to revisit the following research question that we know a lot of studies about, which is what explains the differential levels of local government performance. So before getting into the theory and background, I want to offer like an overview of the presentation. I will first introduce to like related literature and my argument. Then I will talk about the research design, and finally I will present the findings along with some alternative explanations. Before getting into the theory, as I said, I want to talk about why local government performance and why public services. And that's because in addition to its impact on equity and citizen social welfare, local government performance and public services are also very important in terms of its political outcomes and political implications. For example, we know from the literature that variations and inequalities in public service provision may affect support for the incumbent, but in addition to these short-term electoral outcomes, it may also determine the long-term trust in the state and state legitimacy, and in some cases, it can even decrease support for democracy. And of course, if these inequalities in service provision overlap with identity-based cleavages, subnational inequalities in local bureaucratic performance may even create or strengthen ethnic or other identity-based conflicts. And of course, because of its importance for politics, this research question, so the subnational variations and the factors affecting local government performance, has been a widely studied topic. Here, one group focused on, most literature focused on accountability explanations. One group focuses on electoral accountability and targeting of state resources according to factors such as the level of competition, identity of the district, or level of information about politicians' performance, such as media. For example, if there is access to like free media and information about politicians' performance, politicians are more likely to be accountable. And a second group of literature focuses on sanctioning of bureaucrats instead of politicians, indirectly through politicians' oversight over bureaucrats. So this time we are talking about politicians' oversight over bureaucrats instead of citizens' oversight over politicians. And a third group focuses on local accountability mechanisms such as community oversight mechanisms or local media channels. And with the exception of Chai's work, which focuses on citizens' informal sanctioning over bureaucrats, most of these studies focus on formal accountability mechanisms. However, even though politicians and bureaucrats may want to respond to citizen sanctioning, there is no guarantee that they will have the capacity to do so. In other words, while we focus on politicians and official willingness to provide quality public services in the literature, their ability to do so is equally crucial. And in addition to that, accountability explanations provide little explanation for the variations within the same political or administrative units, such as differences between two adjacent neighborhoods, for example. And finally, there is a lot of actually null finding or evidence, weak evidence about whether electoral accountability or other accountability mechanisms such as community oversight actually work. And therefore, citizen sanctioning of politicians and bureaucrats probably cannot explain all the variations in local government performance. So to complement the existing approaches in the literature, this study offers a capacity-based explanation to local government performance. And specifically, I argue that subnational variations in local government performance are often the outcome of bureaucratic efficiency and effectiveness rather than accountability to politicians' accountability or bureaucrats' accountability. And I predict that bureaucratic efficiency is higher in political geographies with high social proximity among bureaucrats, by which I mean bureaucrats' social ties with other bureaucrats in their jurisdiction. And this is because there are many bureaucratic transaction costs associated with the production and allocation process of public services, so local governance processes. And very briefly, social ties between bureaucrats can reduce these transaction costs and increase bureaucratic efficiency and effectiveness by offering extra information and cooperation channels to bureaucrats. So this is briefly the argument, and I will elaborate this a bit more here. Of course, the prototypical ideal bureaucracy is a Weberian one, which is defined by Weber as a rational, legal, public administration with a strict division of labor, a hierarchical structure, and a bureaucracy where all processes are impersonal and based on rules. And Weber argues that a bureaucracy with these characteristics should be like an efficient one. But we know that even in cases where the reality approaches this Weberian ideal, bureaucracies are far from perfect and involve many transaction costs, such as red tape and time costs, allocative inefficiencies between different administrative departments, and slacking and shirking behavior by bureaucrats toward each other. And these types of transaction costs usually stem from informational asymmetries and lack of sanctioning mechanisms. And of course, importantly, these internal bureaucratic transaction costs should be especially salient for local bureaucracies because there are too many actors in multiple institutions that need to coordinate with each other to provide services to people. Nonetheless, because bureaucratic transaction costs mainly result from informational asymmetries and lack of sanctioning mechanisms, social ties, information and cooperation channels provided by social ties can provide some remedy and can create some positive externalities that can reduce these transaction costs. And this is because, as established by the social capital and social network literature, social ties do not only serve communication and socialization purposes, but they create some positive externalities such as informal information and cooperation channels, so they can increase information flow and cooperation between people. And for that, I want to give an example. For example, imagine two individuals, one district administrator and one village head, which we call muhtar in Turkish and also in Arabic. He befriends with. Informal information flows between the district administrator and the village head are not limited to personal issues. They simultaneously transfer information on work-related matters. And similarly, repeated informal interactions and the resulting social sanctioning between two bureaucrats will cause them to comply with certain behavioral norms, such as reciprocity and helping each other, and thus lead to greater informal cooperation. So the informal information flows and cooperation are the key mechanisms here. And therefore, I argue that bureaucratic efficiency and effectiveness and local government performance can be higher in political geographies with high social proximity among bureaucrats. And before starting with the research design, I want to offer some background information about the setting, which is Turkey. Turkey has a very centralized governance structure, and most governance processes and most public services are provided and administered by a strict nested hierarchy. And this centralized character of the governance structure helps us isolate many factors, such as many potential factors, such as subnational differences in administrative rules or access to financial resources that are commonly seen in more decentralized and federal systems. And importantly, the only elected official in this hierarchical structure are village heads, muhtars, which is an important piece of information here, because even though they are officials and non-partisan, since they are elected by local population, they are usually from the same ethnic and religious background as the local population. So while the majority of public officials are usually from the majority ethnic and religious background in Turkey, village heads of minority villages are going to be from a minority background in terms of their ethnic and religious characteristics. And here I will provide a brief summary of the several tests I will do in this study. So I'm basically testing 3 different implications of this theory. In the first one, I check whether social proximity between bureaucrats, as proxied by geographic proximity, increases bureaucratic efficiency. And because I use geographic proximity as a proxy here, which I will talk more about in the coming slide, I also do a second and third test to show that bureaucratic efficiency and effectiveness is in general low in socially fragmented administrative units as measured by network indicators, or when there are ethnic and religious divisions between bureaucrats, regardless of geographic proximity. So because I use geographic proximity as a proxy for social proximity, I further show that the mechanism that geographic proximity's effect produces is really about social proximity, by basically interacting the geographic proximity measure with the social fragmentation and ethnicity measures. But I will give more information about the second and third tests in the coming slides, and start with the first analysis here. Regarding the geographic proximity proxy, there is actually ample evidence in urban economics and social networks literatures that show a strong relationship between geographic proximity and social ties. But I also validate this measure through the closed-ended questions from my interviews, which I conducted during my fieldwork. So these figures show how geographic distance between district governors and muhtars translate to basically social relationships between them. During 6 months of fieldwork, I conducted approximately 170 interviews with village heads and bureaucrats from regions of Turkey with different social and ethnic geographies. And here I examined responses to these closed-ended questions from interviews and surveys with bureaucrats. And in both of these figures, the x-axis shows the distance of a given district to a given village office below its jurisdiction. And each point on the plot, therefore, represents a village head. And when we come to the y-axis on the left shows the average response of the district administrators to a question about how well they know the muhtar of a specific village. And the y-axis on the right shows the average response of a muhtar to questions about how well he or she knows district level bureaucrats in specific positions on average. And as expected, there is a significant negative correlation between geographic distance and how well muhtars and district level bureaucrats know each other, which provides an additional validation for the geographic proximity proxy. And now I will move on to the empirical strategy and data. Of course, this correlation between geographic distance and informal ties is likely to affect bureaucratic efficiency and effectiveness. But in order to show this relationship causally, I leverage a quasi-experimental design, specifically a geographical regression discontinuity design. And in this design, I use J-coded data from all the districts and villages in Turkey, which means approximately 970 districts and 35,000 villages in an unrestricted sample. I collected the geolocation information of all villages by combining various different sources of data, such as spatial vector data, Google Maps APIs, or sometimes by manually checking the locations of villages to prevent biases, because villages in some remote locations cannot appear on Google Maps sometimes. And now I will briefly walk through the empirical strategy. These are 3 districts I visited as part of my fieldwork. I'm showing this just as an example because the sample includes all the districts in Turkey. In this design, I first categorize district borders as separate segments. So each borderline between each pair of districts represents a separate segment. And so we can say this one is a first segment, this one is a second border segment, and this one at the bottom is a third segment. And for illustration purposes, I will focus on this third segment here. The identification assumption of this geographical discontinuity design, which helps us to establish a causal relationship between geographic distance and bureaucratic efficiency, is that if we only focus on villages close to border areas, or using the RDD language, if we only focus on villages within a certain bandwidth, villages around the same border segments should be very similar to each other, except on which side of the border they are located. And this is important because as we pass from the left side of the border to the right side of the border here, for example, the home district of villages and therefore their distance to district headquarters change sharply at the border, while other characteristics remain similar. Or more intuitively, let's say this is village A and village B. These are very close to each other. They are probably seeing each other on a daily basis, and they have similar cultural and economic characteristics or socioeconomic levels. But the one on the right-hand side is located in districts on the right, which is why it has actually a closer distance to its own district headquarters compared to village A here, whose district quarter is located further away. And basically the comparison, I exploit this as if random variation in distance to district headquarters, which changes sharply at the border, to see the effect of geographic proximity between village and district offices on village level efficiency and effectiveness outcomes. And the continuous independent variable here is simply distance to district headquarters. And of course, because I use a geographical RDD, I will only use villages very close to the border segment. And to present the main results, I use the distance of 2.5 kilometers, but I check the validity of the results, robustness of the results by different bandwidths. So one thing that I want to highlight here is that regression discontinuity designs rely on the assumption that while one characteristic changes sharply at the border, like distance to district headquarters, other characteristics remain similar. But this assumption wouldn't hold true if certain types of villages sort on the side of the border closer to district headquarters, or if some district borders are manipulated to favor certain types of villages. And therefore, I look at the density of villages between the two sides of the border and do a McCrary test, which is the commonly used test for this assumption, and find no evidence of sorting. And this null finding is not surprising because most of the villages in Turkey have their origins in the Ottoman era and predate district borders. And the manipulation of district borders is not likely because of, due to electoral motivations, is not likely. So gerrymandering is not likely in terms of like district borders because districts are only administrative units nested in provincial administration, provinces, which are electoral districts. So in which district a village is located doesn't affect provincial outcomes, provincial electoral outcomes, which are multi-member electoral districts. So basically the location of the village doesn't affect the electoral outcomes as long as it is located in the same province. So the which district a village locates doesn't really matter in terms of elections. And another reason why the manipulation of district borders is unlikely is that most current borders today were drawn in 1924 based on mostly natural boundaries such as rivers, mountains, and lakes, or following straight lines sometimes. I can, if you have any questions, clarification questions, please feel free to ask. So this is the main equation I use in this empirical strategy. Here, distance and y are my most important variables. Y is the outcome variable, bureaucratic efficiency, and distance is the geographic distance of the village to district headquarters. So I use this model to estimate the beta here, which will show the effect of geographic distance on bureaucratic efficiency and effectiveness, controlling for other village level factors, as well as segment-specific and district-specific characteristics. And the rest of the equation here, this local polynomial, which consists of the longitude and latitude of the village, and district fixed effects and segment fixed effects, they make sure that I only compare the villages around a given border segment to each other and isolate the district and segment-specific factors so that I can see only the pure effect of geographic distance on bureaucratic efficiency. Okay, so for the dependent variable, I use two sets of different indicators. The first two indicators are basically my favorite measures because they are direct measures of bureaucratic efficiency and effectiveness. These are directly related to bureaucratic processes. And specifically, the first one shows whether district officials can get or have access to village heads' cell phone information, personal cell phone information. And This is a good indicator for bureaucratic efficiency, obviously, because if bureaucratic efficiency and effectiveness, because that means that district administrators can get access to village head cell phone information. And the second indicator, I should also add that this information comes from an village inventory project implemented at the beginning of 2000. So this information comes from the beginning of 2000s, in which basically all district administrators try to collect data on villages, including village head cell phone information. And the variable specifically takes a value of 1 if the district administrators could access village head cell phone information, and 0 if they couldn't get access to their personal cell phone information. And the second one is another process, or let's say direct measure of bureaucratic efficiency and effectiveness, because it is basically about whether the quality of villages in a village, the quality of water in a village is being regularly controlled or not. And this is important because it is a task for which health officials in the district center and village officials have to coordinate with each other. And if they cannot coordinate, they cannot conduct regular controls for the quality of the water in the village. I choose 2 other measures related to water infrastructure again, and the reason why I choose water is like several. First of all, while many public goods such as health and education rely on the basically centrally made decisions, or the investments for them are made by the central government and by politicians, water infrastructure and water services are public goods and public services that heavily depend on the local transactions and transactions of bureaucrats. So basically, the quality of water infrastructure in the village depends on the interactions and coordination of local bureaucrats, while decisions about like schools and health clinics are usually made at the higher levels of the hierarchy and by the central government. And therefore, this is as a quality in public goods provision measure, this is a suitable one due to its reliance on local bureaucratic processes. And the second reason is that water is a basic public service that must be provided in every village, unlike, let's say, schools or health clinics, which are located only in certain hubs and central locations. And therefore, we cannot use it as a quality indicator, as it doesn't have to be, as they don't have to be provided in every village. And specifically, the first indicator shows whether the village has a water supply network or has access to water through a water supply network or through an alternative means. And the second indicator here is about the quality of drinking water infrastructure, which basically tells us whether the village has access to a drinking water infrastructure system that is cleaned by through a water supply network. But they are different things because drinking water infrastructure also includes the cleaning process. So in addition to, of course, the dependent variable measures and the independent variable measures, the model also includes a battery of district and village level controls. And the district level controls include actually, the first one is only included in the additional analysis because the model doesn't cover the AKP period during which Erdogan governed, but I did a robustness check with that. But the main model in general includes district level population statistic, literacy rates, economic development level as measured or as proxied by average night light density, and information on government investments as measured by the number of health and education buildings per capita. And the village level controls are as follows. They include distance to the closest highway, distance of the village to the closest urban areas with a population over 50,000, 100,000, or 500,000, the elevation of the village, and the sect and ethnicity of the village, as well as the conservative vote share. And here, a brief note on data sources. The reason why I use like different types of data rather than official statistics is usually because fine-grained data is very limited in many developing country contexts, because of both like capacity and data transparency reasons. And therefore, I had to collect a substantial part of the data by using like different tools. For instance, data about village level outcome measures, as well as the geolocation of villages, were mostly scraped from official web pages. Because the government doesn't collect information on the ethnicity and sect of villages, or doesn't provide them, I manually coded, of course, with the help of a research assistant, I manually coded the village level ethnicity and sect data set. And for economic development, because the government doesn't provide information on the economic development of the districts, I'm using average night lights density, which is a commonly used economic development measure in the literature. And now that I'm done with the research design and data, I will move on to the findings of the first analysis, and then I will also move on to the second and third tests, which prove us more evidence about the mechanism here. Regarding the effect of geographic distance on bureaucratic efficiency and effectiveness, I find that the geographic distance indeed decreases bureaucratic efficiency and effectiveness. And here, each estimate in this graph shows the results for a different dependent variable measure, and the y-axis shows the effect of a one standard deviation change in distance to district headquarters. The effect of geographic distance on indicators like access to cell phone information or water quality controls is negative, and as you can see, it decreases access to cell phone information by around 3.5%, and the likelihood of having regular water quality controls by around 6%. And in terms of like public service outcome measures, the decreases are around 4% for the water supply network and 6% for the drinking water infrastructure. And in the main analysis, in the main graph I showed you, I'm using a bandwidth of 2.5 kilometers, which means that the sample only includes villages that are a maximum of 2.5 kilometers from the border segments, so that I can compare only villages that are closely located to each other, basically to compare apples with apples. But of course, I also check the results by different bandwidth choices to make sure that this is just not just a random like statistical significance. And as you can see here, the results are robust to different bandwidth choices, and as expected, as the sample gets smaller, for example, for a bandwidth of 1.5 kilometers, we are starting getting insignificant results due to sample size. But the coefficient or the estimate, the size of the estimates remains more or less similar. And in the second and third analysis, I'm basically trying to confirm the mechanism through which geographic proximity operates. And for that, I examine whether geographic proximity between bureaucrats is less likely to influence bureaucratic efficiency in socially fragmented provinces, or when there are ethnic divisions between bureaucrats, between district administrators and village heads. The first test relies on the idea that social fragmentation reduces the reachability of any given individual in a province, regardless of their geographic positions, including bureaucrats. In other words, in socially fragmented provinces, which are like the size of large cities usually, such as Istanbul and Ankara, it will be hard for bureaucrats to establish or maintain social ties with each other or with bureaucrats in other villages in the district center or in the province center. So there will be like basically not much social connection between bureaucrats at the same level or at different levels of the hierarchy. And therefore, in socially fragmented provinces, we should see low bureaucratic efficiency, regardless of the geographic positions of village heads and district administrators, and geographic distance should disappear at higher levels of social fragmentation. I mean, the effect of geographic distance should disappear. And empirically, that means that I look at the heterogeneity of the effect of geographic distance across provinces with different levels of social fragmentation, for which I use a network indicator that relies on antenna level mobile call traffic. And this network indicator, like very briefly, if you're interested, you can also look at my paper on the website, which explains the details of the network indicator. But it very briefly gives information about how much different neighborhoods of a province communicate with each other. And as I said, I'm using antenna level mobile call data to measure the social connections between different neighborhoods in a province to obtain a social fragmentation measure in the end. And why do I measure social fragmentation by a network indicator instead of maybe easier or like more traditional variables such as ethnic diversity? The reason is that social fragmentation doesn't necessarily result from like ethnic divisions or religious differences. It may even result like from differences in terms of like people's hometowns. Like if there are people from many different hometowns living in the same town, then of course we expect more social fragmentation in that town, while in more homogeneous towns where most people were born in that town, we should see lower social fragmentation. So basically, social fragmentation has a lot of, doesn't necessarily result from a single factor like ethnic diversity. It can result from several factors rooted in different identity-based distinctions such as hometown backgrounds, religious identities, or even political views. And the network indicator, network data, has the advantage of capturing of all these potential sources of social fragmentation in a province. And these three figures illustrate the relationship between the province level social fragmentation indicator and other diversity indicators. The x-axis shows the social fragmentation score by province, and the y-axis shows the values of the levels of hometown fractionalization, ethnic fractionalization, and political fractionalization. I will not give the details here. Of course, we can talk more about these in the Q&A if you're interested. But as you can see, the social fragmentation score is positively correlated with all of these potential social cohesion or social fragmentation measures. And here I'm showing the effect of geographic distance and whether it changes by the level of social fragmentation in a province. And here on the x-axis, social fragmentation increases to the right. The y-axis shows the effect of each additional kilometer in distance to district headquarters on bureaucratic efficiency and effectiveness. And each graph shows a different indicator of bureaucratic efficiency and effectiveness. And the direct measures are, of course, the access to personal cell phone information and water quality controls, for which health officials and village heads need to come together. And in line with theoretical expectations in general, the geography proxy only works in socially cohesive districts, while in socially fragmented districts, the effect of geographic distance disappears, which I think provides some evidence that the effect of geographic proximity really works through social proximity here. And the second heterogeneity test relies on the idea that if the effect of geographic distance is indeed driven by social proximity between bureaucrats, it should decrease when village officials are from different ethnic backgrounds. And this relies on the idea that when there are ethnic or religious divisions between bureaucrats, between district administrators and village heads in this case, we should see low bureaucratic efficiency and low bureaucratic effectiveness, regardless of the geographic positions of bureaucrats. And for this test, for simplicity, I simply analyze how the effect of geographic distance, again in a regression discontinuity context, differs when we restrict our sample only to ethnic or religious minority villages, which are Kurdish and Alevi villages in the Turkish context. And as you can see in these figures, when the analysis is restricted to a comparison between proximate and distance villages within the Alevi or Kurdish subsamples, I find that not only are the effects of geographic distance treatment statistically insignificant across all the village level bureaucratic efficiency or effectiveness measures, but the directions of the effects become either positive or very close to zero and inconsistent across different outcome measures. So the insignificance we find here is not just something about sample size, but we are seeing a different result. The size of the effect is different and inconsistent. And here I'm showing the results by different bandwidths. And here too, the estimate remains to be statistically insignificant even at very large bandwidths for Kurdish and Alevi villages. So basically, if there are ethnic or religious divisions between district administrators and village heads, or if these are located in socially fragmented provinces such as Istanbul, then we don't see high bureaucratic efficiency or high bureaucratic effectiveness anyway. And the geographic distance between these different offices doesn't make a difference. Finally, I also did some additional analyses to address some potential alternative explanations. One common alternative explanation might be that proximate villages may simply show show higher performance due to lower logistical and infrastructural costs in basically villages closer to district headquarters. And of course, this may be a problem for the dependent variable indicators related to the quality of water infrastructure, even though it's not necessarily the case for access to cell phone information. And therefore, to see if the effect of geographic proximity is something about low logistical costs in proximate villages, I examine whether the effect of geographic distance on an infrastructure-intensive public good is similar. So I'm basically choosing a public service outcome, schools, and I'm trying to see if there are fewer schools in more distant villages, because that will indicate that in the Turkish context, logistical or transactional or infrastructural costs of more distant and remote villages is indeed a problem and may cause a decrease in the quality of public services or quantity of public services. And another reason I choose schools is, of course, because decisions about school investments are made by the central government, by Ankara, with no influence from local bureaucrats. And social proximity cannot play a role here. So if we find a insignificant finding here, that will indicate that infrastructural costs are not likely to play a role in local government performance in remote villages. And of course, for schools, if logistical or infrastructural costs have an impact, they should really have a huge impact in the case of schools, because it's a really high infrastructure intensive service and needs large investments, and the staff will need to commute to villages, etc. So the salience of potential logistical and infrastructural costs should be high for school investments. Anyways, to see if that's the case, if geographic distance has an impact on whether the village has a school or not, I estimate the effect of geographic proximity on a binary variable that shows whether there is a school, the elementary school in the village. And the results showed that proximate villages do not receive more school investments than control villages, than more remote villages. And the direction of the effect is not consistent either by different bandwidths. So I think these findings provide some evidence that logistical or infrastructural costs in more remote villages are unlikely to play a role in the findings about the quality of water infrastructure, because if they were important, they will first be important in the case of these large in these public good investments like schools, which require large investments. And another potential alternative explanation may be that maybe like closer villages that are closer to district headquarters are simply places with higher economic development levels. And therefore they perform better in terms of all kinds of indicators that require some sort of human or financial capital. And to address this alternative explanation, I use the idea that if proximate villages are more economically developed, and therefore they are basically the ones with higher bureaucratic efficiency and effectiveness, they should also have better access to services provided by private companies, such as electricity in the case of Turkey, and they should also own more private assets. And using the data from the same village inventory, which I used to gather information about access to cell phone information, I also gathered information about whether the village has access to electricity and which are provided by private companies, and whether the village head owns a computer or not. And basically, the dependent variable measures here show that are binary variables that show that whether the village has an electricity grid, and the second one shows whether the village head has a personal computer. And the results showed again that the effect of geographic proximity on these private services and assets is not significant. And the direction of the effect is actually positive instead of negative for some reason. But I basically couldn't find a statistically significant difference between more proximate and more distant villages in terms of access to private services and personal private assets of village heads. In a nutshell, I think this study provides evidence that social proximity among bureaucrats may indeed increase bureaucratic efficiency and effectiveness. And by doing so, I believe that it contributes to like several different lines of research in the literature, in the political science literature. First of all, by highlighting the role of community characteristics in bureaucratic efficiency and effectiveness and bureaucratic performance, it shows that even in a centralized state like Turkey, state capacity doesn't have to be uniform at the local level. It may systematically change by the sociological characteristics of local relations between people, including bureaucrats, because bureaucrats are also people and like are part of the community. So it matters what level their social relationships with each other are and whether that contributes to bureaucratic coordination and information flows between them. And second, while most studies on local government performance focus on the sanctioning of bureaucrats or politicians by citizens, I think this study shows that we should also pay attention to relationships between bureaucrats. So in addition to the like citizen bureaucrats, citizen politician or politician bureaucrat dyads to explain public service quality, we should also look at bureaucrat-bureaucrat relationships, which is usually pretended or taken as a black box in the political science literature. And third, I think the findings also have implications for the ethnicity and public goods literature, because it shows that if social proximity between bureaucrats moves along the ethnicity dimension, if ethnic distinctions between bureaucrats makes bureaucratic coordination less likely, then that would create an additional reason for why we would have lower governance outcomes in more heterogeneous or minority communities and neighborhoods, which may, as long as, of course, they include bureaucrats from minority backgrounds as well. This was all I was going to present for today. Thanks a lot for listening, and I look forward to your comments and questions.